I'm Brent Runyon, Executive Director of the Providence Preservation Society. I want to welcome everyone here this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Before we get underway, I want to acknowledge that the Providence Preservation Society is situated upon the ancestral and unceded lands of the Narragansett Nation. This acknowledgement reminds us of the significance of place, the continued existence of Indigenous people, and my organization's commitment to building respectful relationships with those who call these lands home today. This year's symposium explores the systems and inequalities that have shaped our built environment and the communities that inhabit it. It came out of our response to the events of the past year, which are still ongoing. We realize that it's never been more important to reflect on whose places have historically been prioritized and for us to recognize what needs to change moving forward. The interdisciplinary approach to this year's symposium gives us a good framework for thinking about the intertwined nature of issues such as climate, housing, design, transportation, reflective diversity, and historic preservation, and their possible solutions. The preservation movement has to reorient itself around the questions people care about in order to affect meaningful change in our neighborhoods and cities. I want to call your attention to the next program in the symposium, which is Monday at 5:30, where we'll hear from Catherine Levine about neighborhood defenders, participatory politics in America's housing crisis. Tickets are still available on our website, and I hope you'll join us. Tonight's session is being recorded. We encourage you to enter your questions or comments in the chat box. And following the panel discussion, we'll get to as many of your questions as possible. We'll also be posting this video for viewing following the symposium. I want to thank all of our sponsors, but especially our session sponsor for tonight, which is Art Pack Services, Inc. Tonight's program is a panel discussion that tackles the question of who authorizes cultural heritage and decides what places are worth protecting and celebrating. This panel discussion will explore the formal preservation systems currently in place and how they work for and against communities. Our guests will offer insight on how preservation works at the municipal, state, and federal levels, and how the processes are responding to demands for change. I want to thank our esteemed panel tonight, which is composed of Sherry A. Frear, Chief of the National Register of Historic Places and National Historic Landmarks Program. Claudia Guerra is San Antonio's first cultural historian, a position in the Office of Historic Preservation. J. Paul Loether is the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Historical Preservation and Heritage Commission and the State Historic Preservation Officer for Rhode Island, and is the former keeper of the National Register, which is one of those jobs your high school guidance counselor never told you about, but you wish they had. Stephanie Ryberg Webster is an associate professor in the Department of Urban Studies at Cleveland State University's Levin College of Urban Affairs. And our moderator tonight is my friend and colleague, Elaine Stiles, an assistant professor of historic preservation in the School of Architecture, Art, and Historic Preservation at Roger Williams University in Bristol, Rhode Island. So the panel discussion will go for about 60 minutes. Afterward, we'll have time for audience questions. We ask, and again, if you have thoughts and comments, please enter those in the chat box. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you, panelists, and welcome, Elaine. I'll turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for what I know will be a stimulating conversation with our colleagues who are among some of our national leaders in historic preservation, thought, and policy. And I'm really pleased to be here with all of them. Just in terms of an overview of our panel discussion, kind of I don't know, a sort of pacing for today. I'm going to be asking each of our panelists a question about their experience and perspective on our topic for today, and then we'll invite the other panelists to respond with their views. And we look forward, of course, to all of the questions from our audience as well. So I'm going to ask if you might put those, please, in the Q&A chat that's at the bottom. There's a chat and then a Q&A you might see at the bottom of your screen. The Q&A helps us a little bit to manage the questions better so we can get to as many of them as possible. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to start off with you, Sherry, and ask you a little bit of a question that kind of about your role at the National Register and about you're relatively new in that role, just having joined in May. And so as chief of the National Register of Historic Places and the National Historic Landmarks Program, you're presiding over the nation's official lists of sites we consider, to quote, worthy of preservation, right? So kind of the central theme of our conversation today. And these are obviously important catalogs of sites that express to many of us what our nation considers to be its collective heritage. And I know over the past 10 years, the Park Service has made, and the programs you're now leading, has made effort expanding these lists to ensure more equitable representation of minority and minoritized groups a priority. Many of whom have been significantly underrepresented in those programs in the past. And I was wondering if you can update us on where the NR and the NHL programs are now with these efforts, and maybe share some of your thoughts on how the programs can or may expand these efforts in the future, just to kick us off.
Thank you, Elaine. And let me say how pleased I am to be here today and to have an opportunity to participate in this and to hopefully field some questions from folks sitting in with us today. I am indeed very new in this position. I've been in this position for 6 months now. I came on board during a time of full-time telework, so it's been a bit challenging to get up to speed. But I can tell you, I work with a team of very dedicated reviewers who are very excited about the potential for expanding the National Register to ensure that it truly does reflect sites of importance to all communities. In the past 10 years alone, we have issued or updated theme studies to help guide preparations of nominations on civil rights, Latino heritage, Asian American, and Pacific Islander heritage. Indeed, just came out 2 years ago. So hopefully with that additional guidance, that will broaden the nominations that come into us. Another thing then we are excited about looking at is reissuing our bulletins. There's a lot of good information in those bulletins, but I think they can use an update. And I know there was a process started a few years ago. Now, over the past few years, we've had a number of senior leadership folks in acting positions. And that makes it difficult a lot of times to have an initiative and to move that forward. Oftentimes when folks are in an acting position, they're simply trying to keep the car on the road. But we've got some positions now that have been filled, including mine, and hopefully we can reinvigorate those initiatives. We can issue some new bulletins to provide additional guidance, to provide support to folks that want to submit nominations on properties that perhaps have been overlooked in the past. Along with that, I was just speaking this afternoon with one of my reviewers about the potential for offering better examples, putting some samples up online. Oftentimes, the simple fact of the matter is we can only review what we receive. We can only list what we receive. But as a national program, it's incumbent on us, I think, to provide guidance if it's lacking, to help folks prepare nominations for properties that are important to them and their communities. And that's something that I hope to invigorate, as I said, and some new initiatives to get underway over the course of the next year or so.
Thank you. And as a follow-up question to that, I wanted to ask, and then actually ask our other panelists to chime in on this question as well. Are there ways that the National Register and the National Historic Landmark programs might become more accessible to those perhaps outside the preservation profession, or expansive in terms of considering cultural as well as historical and architectural significance? And actually, I'd love to hear a little bit more about some ways that you think, that maybe local communities or states can actually work with the programs to maybe solicit or encourage more nominations that sort of meet some of the more sort of overarching programmatic goals to be more representative.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that question. It's an excellent question, and again, something I was just discussing with another one of my reviewers about 2 hours ago. How do we support folks in preparing those nominations? I think we're familiar with nominations from the 70s that were oftentimes 3, 4, 5 pages long. I know I have worked on nominations that have become 60, 70, 80 pages long. I don't know that that level of scholarship is always required. Now, certainly one does have to thoroughly document significance and integrity. If that's not happening, if that's a challenge for folks, again, I think that's incumbent on the national program to provide better guidance, better information, better examples. And we can certainly continue to work with our partners, both in the state offices and in the private organizations, and perhaps find a way to expand our community outreach as well.
Okay. Other colleagues on the panel, thoughts from you on that question?
I have, if I may ask, can I ask Sherry kind of a follow-up question? Is that rather than my comments, I find this all incredibly, terrific, right? These ideas about expanding access and trying to generate more ideas. I wonder if at the same time, so I kind of have two questions. If there's been any discussion of guidance for updating some older nominations that perhaps ignored things that we now wouldn't ignore. So there's one part of trying to get new nominations in for things that we want to recognize now, but I think there's a lot of cases of places already listed, but they don't necessarily address the full dynamics of a place as we might address them now. And kind of the second part of my question, which is disconnected, is about, every semester that I teach my intro to historic preservation class, I have students do an exercise where they have to find a National Register nomination online and analyze it. And part of their assignment is to critique the accessibility of the database itself, right? And so I'm wondering if as we're thinking about inclusivity and broadening the sphere of who participates, if that is on your agenda in any way as well.
With respect to the first item, the question of updating nominations, I think that's a resource question. We are seeing more nominations coming in with updates, particularly for properties in the South, where perhaps previously they were submitted simply for their relevance under criteria C for their architecture. We're now seeing updates coming in where they're capturing truly the full story, the full experience of the communities and folks on those properties. Again, like I said, I think it's a resource issue, and that requires coordination with my colleagues in the other preservation programs. We can certainly provide guidance, and that's something, again, we're looking at in updating our bulletin on how you simply update a National Register nomination, because what will be important there too is capturing those areas of significance. When we look at National Register nominations, again, from the 70s, there might have been 20 areas of significance. And I was just checking the list the other day, and we now have over 50. So oftentimes when we're asked about properties that represent certain communities, our numbers appear skewed when we simply check our database because we weren't capturing that data then. So that's an important point that we do update not only our own information, but those nominations as well, so that we're sure that what we already have on the register is reflective of the American experience. And then with respect to the accessibility of these nominations, that is a challenge. Again, something I'm looking forward to better understanding and finding a way forward on that. We do have a database. We do send our documents to the Library of Congress. We have an archive staff that does an outstanding job of organizing these materials and trying to support folks in trying to find nominations. But that is work that is ongoing and that we'll continue to do.
I have a comment. This is Claudia in San Antonio, if I may. So working with many of the communities that are underrepresented in the National Register, the thing that continually comes up is capacity and just having the time to actually work on a nomination. And most of these are working class communities. So they don't have, they're busy working. They're busy trying to just, pay the rent, get food on the table. And those who maybe have that scholarship level are so, again, also involved with community at a level that there just isn't time. So I think maybe it's a question of thinking about some innovative programming. Maybe there's it's always about funding, right? So maybe there's some sort of scholarships that can be provided so that somebody has the opportunity to even see this as a part-time job, to start filling out nominations, or maybe working with students at the university level who should be learning this skill. And I say that because I'm complicit in it. I've turned in 76, 80-page nominations. And some of that I think is daunting for the local community. And although we offer our expertise in our local office to help people with that, I think just even feeling like they can get it together to even approach us about that is daunting for them. So, maybe it's a level of workshops with NGOs, and maybe there's little scholarships that can be provided to a writer. Those things may begin to open up a pathway.
Those are terrific suggestions. Thank you. And I am continuing to coordinate with my colleagues with other preservation programs, our grant program, our tax credit program even, because they have some direct pipelines to some folks that are more at the local level, and to see if we can provide additional guidance through that venue as well.
Oh, go ahead, Paul.
Just a couple of comments. Yeah, it's capacity all the way up and down the line. And remember that the national program and the keeper's office, they are the end of the line.
Mm-hmm.
Everything has to go through state offices, and everything that gets written has to be reviewed by state offices. Born in Rhode Island, I can't tell you how big a budget cut I'm facing already, and our staffing is not at the level where we can do much more other than stand on the sidelines and cheer and somebody does something. And even then, when they do, we have to go through a review process, and that requires staffing time. So capacity across the board. I think the biggest issue right now, money doesn't buy love, but it sure buys capacity. And that would be something certainly all the state historic preservation offices and the Park Service are continually working on that. We'll see how the new administration shapes up. The other thing is, keep in mind that the National Register, when it was originally created as a program that would be targeted at the federal agency planning processes. So while you want to have good information and scholarship's important, even those 2-page, 2x2 photograph nominations from 1978, if it's listed in the register, when we go through environmental review, no SHPO is limited to what's in that nomination. It's nice to have a nomination that's thorough, well-researched, well-prepared. But the hook is that it's listed or it's eligible. Once that happens, and then again, it requires a lot of staffing time on our part, but that's where, if you will, the rubber hits the road, is the protection side. So they still have value. And yes, updating is a good idea. But that said, it has to be balanced against the fact that there's a growing number of resources that are eligible out there that have no evaluation whatsoever. So it's a balancing act. I know in the National Historic Landmark Program, some of the members of the board used to complain, why are we seeing all these updates when there's all this other work to do? So it's not an easy balance to strike. Again, it's not something, the process overall tends to be reactive in terms of the governmental review process, which is good because it means it's more grassroots in terms of its origins. So, but that's key, capacity across the board. And there's very little initiative that can happen out of the national office. One of the great things that's been done in the past year is the underrepresented communities grants program. Those are eligible projects, that's helpful. But for the most part, you're right, it has to be at the grassroots level, trying to come up with mechanisms to perhaps be more productive and cooperative, even before it hits the state office. The state office is always there for advice and assistance, but those strategies are worth pursuing.
Excellent, thank you, Paul. And actually, I'm going to pitch the next question to you. So you have a depth of experience in cultural resource management, including leadership positions at 2 state historic preservation offices, positions as the deputy keeper and then the keeper of the National Register, which I always say is the best job title in preservation, and as chief of the National Register and NHL programs. And I was wondering if you, given your tenure in the field, if you would talk a little bit about the decision-making process on historic designation and concepts of heritage and how you've seen those change during your tenure. And I'm particularly interested, from my perspective, in considering our theme today about the role of expertise and scholarship, which remain really strong, but as kind of reflected in our conversation here, do you see a role for consideration of less official perspectives in those decision-making processes, and meaning sort of non-scholarly voices in terms of deciding what is significant or in articulating significance in ways that don't necessarily maybe fit into our typical scholarly boxes?
I'll answer the second question first, and then I want you to remind me not to forget to address it in detail afterwards. The answer to the second question is yes, and I'll answer that in greater detail down the line. In terms of changes, programs have changed a lot in terms of what's actually being produced and whatnot. The structure of the review process really hasn't. Still starts at usually a local level. There's an interface with the state office. The state office is kind of the first level of review, of significant review. Then it goes back and forth there, and then it eventually winds up in the keeper's office. That process hasn't changed. I know that at the national level, nominations come in sometimes from states. It's not uncommon for nominations which are either interesting or controversial to have 5, 6, 7 staff members sit down and go through and discuss them, especially if it's something that seems to be a little unusual that hasn't been seen before. And my understanding, having been in the business for a while, is that it's always been like that. People don't realize it doesn't go to the keeper's office and the keeper reads it, stamps it. It goes through, in some cases, a detailed review process. Now, having said that, there are some which are pretty pro forma, and they go through without any question or issue. So, but there've been a number of changes. I actually predate the concept of, or at least the publication of, traditional cultural properties. That was a whole new wrinkle, and it speaks to an issue which sometimes the register is successful with, and sometimes it's not. There has a tendency in my career for people to kind of say, well, the register should do this, and the register should do that, and the register should do this. Traditional cultural properties works. It's not an easy one in the register because it deals with a whole different ball game, especially when you're dealing with indigenous peoples and belief systems. It's not what we were taught in school in terms of, well, materials, design, location, setting. It has all that. But those in particular are very often, especially traditional cultural properties, get tied in with feeling and association. Now, those are two very non-tactile concepts, and they have never been well developed or well thought out. And I think that the process has started at the register. But it's a hard one to grasp because it is, in some ways, the most subjective. And I'll come back to that a little more talking about TCPs, but there have been changes. I think certainly the past 10 years, the new emphasis on there are people who want to have the register be a social justice tool. I'm not sure that that's really reasonable, but it should reflect social justice. The register process is by nature reactive. And in the past, it hasn't been as inclusive as it should be and as it was intended to be. Now, having said that, when I went to college, there was no such thing as Hispanic American studies. Black history was a new thing. So over time, gradually that's expanded. And that's one of the real bright spots, I think, over time in the program that has tried to be and gotten much more aggressive in the past 10 years to be more inclusive. Now, having said that, you face a capacity problem. If you have a Hispanic area which doesn't have a lot of means, they're all working folks, how do you get the bus from here to there? So that still needs to be addressed somewhat. And there are other things, landscapes. Charles Birnbaum and company at the Park Service were working on landscapes a long time ago, but two that kind of didn't get nearly much, design landscapes got a lot of attention, but two that didn't were vernacular and in particular ethnographic. And it's been nice to see over the years, especially with the ethnographic, that's beginning to evolve. In great measure, I think, because of the traditional cultural properties rubric that's been developed. So that's been nice. Climate change. We're wrestling with climate change now at the state level. What can we do for climate change? Nominating properties is important, but the precursor to that is survey. Now, in this case, having accurate survey information is really critical for the planners. Hopefully that will lead to nomination, but more importantly, it will lead to preservation, especially if we deal with situations like whether it's rising water or water and riverine systems backing up, storms, what have you, all of the things that come from that. So it's been nice to see a new focus on that. I know I work with Jack Reed's office down in Washington, and I know Senator Reed is intending to, as he said, depending on how the election goes, my real desire is to submit a major piece of climate change legislation, and that preservation would be an integral part of that. So let's hope that that comes to fruition. So there have been changes. I don't think scholarship has really, scholarship's gotten perhaps more intensive. I think scholarship is important, but I think you can take it to the point where it takes so long to produce nominations. You know, if you're going to scholarship, it's fine. If it's criteria A, address criteria A. Don't worry about the rest. If it's criteria A and C, address those, architecture, history, trends, but don't over elaborate with a lot of historical information that's not pertinent to the point of the project. I saw one come in, I won't say what state it was, 172 pages, 274 photographs. Do we really need this for a, whatever, it's 120 building district? Probably not. The enthusiasm was wonderful. The review was really annoying, time-wise and effort-wise. So scholarship is important, but I think, as you all know, good history isn't volume. Good history is stick with the facts and go through the analysis. It's harder to write a shorter piece in some ways. So, so scholarship's always been there. The demands have increased, and we probably, I think in many cases, have swung too far into detailed scholarship and going beyond the point of the given nomination. So address those, keep it tighter, I think is helpful. So those are, I don't know if I wrote them down because I don't have a good memory anymore. I'm too old. Yeah, and as I say, the decision-making process hasn't really changed. There were a couple of bumps there in the past administration where decisions were being handed down from the secretary's office without any attention whatsoever to the substance of the matter. But in 3 administrations, it's the only time I experienced that. And hopefully the new administration will let everyone do their jobs. So is that helpful?
Yes, actually. And I have we brought up traditional cultural properties, or TCPs. And actually, this is a question maybe, for, I think everyone here has some on the phone or on the call has some experience with this particular property type. And, in that question, I was asking to Sherry earlier about cultural significance versus historical and architectural significance. I think typically we associate the TCP property type most closely with Native, Indigenous, American Indian populations, but obviously that's not its only potential, sort of historic, that's not the only potential that, sort of areas of significance that, or groups, with resources that could benefit from being listed as on the register as that particular property type. Could you let us know what do you guys see as the potential for that to be expanded and be more commonly used, I guess, around, I'm thinking here particularly in terms of LGBTQ, sort of resources, as well as resources associated with a variety of minority or minoritized groups in the United States.
Yeah,
is there something that we can do to encourage maybe that awareness or regularize the use of that property type?
Right, remember that second question? This kind of helps address it. Yeah, I mean, Indigenous nominations for Indigenous sites, they're not the only things that are TCPs. A number of other things have been looked at. There's a grotto up in New York somewhere. And then there's a Czechoslovakian social club in Queens, in New York City. Again, a lot of the TCP, the fulcrum of TCP is the group. Do you have a recognizable, definable group? And then you start focusing on the cultural traditions of that group. You still have to deal with the other issues. There has to be some level of integrity, integrity across the board. Some will be more important, but this is where feeling and association often come in. You know, in the regulations for Section 106, they talk about Indian tribes having to be acknowledged to have special understanding of their own resources. Sometimes you'll find Indian tribes that have folks that are archaeologists and whatnot, but a lot of it can just be the tradition bearers of the tribe. They are very non-academic. And a lot of those systems are belief-based. And how do you prove a belief? And in some cases, proving a belief is something that's antithetical to their whole tribal tradition. So then you get into those situations. And I know that I had a couple of congressmen say to me, so are you just going to believe what they say? And you know what my answer was? Yeah, I am. You know, after 400 years of the US government breaking every treaty they've ever made, we're not going to trust them. So, and that requires a certain leap of faith. Again, these are resources which are peculiar to them. Same is true with other social groups. But there's a McDonald Hall that was made a National Historic landmark. Can you still see me? Out in, hold on a second.
We can see you, Paul.
Okay, good. I won't bother it. I want to say California, related to Cesar Chavez. The building was moved. It was totally restructured. Most of the materials are gone. So you have no setting, no material integrity, no design integrity, but the group, the Mexican-American farmers felt so strongly about the location and the use of this building historically, that feeling and association became the two primary measures of integrity of the property. I'll be honest with you, I had some trouble with that. I still have trouble getting over the material stuff, but I think there's a recognition that sometimes what matters most is, especially for a given group, is the meaning that the property has for the group. So, and it's possible to do that. I know this, and our staff, when I was there, struggled with these. And over time, I think things have evolved, so people felt a little more comfortable. We were all trained in the Western tradition. And certainly dealing with the social club in New York, that's pretty straightforward for most of us. But when you start dealing with particularly Native Americans, Native Hawaiians, it gets to be a little more, there's a measure of trust that the process and the review process has to give to those who are actually the proponents.
I'm Sherry, Claudia, or Stephanie. Would you like to weigh in as well?
I'd like to make just a note on that. Discussion we've been having quite a bit at the Register is on the issue of integrity and how to put equal emphasis on association and feeling. And I will say, in addition to being a historic preservationist, I am a landscape architect and practiced as a landscape architect for a good many years. And that very much informs the way that I look at a site. I take a very expansive view of a site. I am less, as we are in the landscape, we are less wedded to materials. We appreciate in the landscape that plants being living things are going to come and go more quickly than, say, siding or brick or stone. Oftentimes when I look at a site, I look at its massing and its volume. And of course we all do that. But I think when you're looking at association and feeling, does that massing, does that volume continue to tell that story as well? And I think that was one of the issues in the Chavez building. There was a large meeting room, and while a lot of the materials were gone, it was able to convey its sense of significance because this was a large meeting hall where people would assemble. So I appreciate Paul addressing those issues of feeling and association. That's something that we'll be taking, well, we've been looking at, but it's something that I can appreciate needs further guidance, and folks need more support in terms of how do we apply those? What do those really mean for this particular site? We all know what materials are, and we can all probably make some pretty good calls on design, but feeling and association is something that I think that we need to assist folks with a little more.
I think one of the tools that I'm curious about looking at and thinking how it might apply to feeling and association This is something I've done locally, but I really rely on the borough charter and looking at values as opposed to the terms that we use nationally. So I'm looking at a lot of international models. And I should say that I'm not a traditionally trained preservationist. My background is not even in preservation. I have a master's in consciousness, and part of that was studying spirit of place and spirit of people. And so I use a lot of the UNESCO and the ECOMOS charters and treaties. And what we have really found useful is the idea of values that the Borough Charter identifies. And so we've started creating cultural significance reports and using those values. And we interview, conduct oral histories, conduct cultural mapping, just really try to understand the meaning of a place to people. And what comes out of it, from what I see, and we don't use integrity in San Antonio, we don't think about feeling or association. It's not necessary for designation here, which I'll talk about later. But it does help us identify that underlying meaning that sometimes isn't covered by the vocabulary that we use in traditional preservation terms. So I think there may be something there and maybe of value to look into.
And this is Paul, if I'm still on. I think that was essentially the drive that was behind McDonald Hall. The underlying values to the community and group that this was significant to. And in this case, it could fit into the structures that are available. Keep in mind that whatever happens, you still have to stay within the overall structures that are legislated under the National Act, unless you want to change the act. And opening a piece of legislation or regulation is always risky. But that said, you know, I've never found the structure of the register to be something that you couldn't work with. You might have to think about it a little differently. If I was in the Supreme Court, I would not be a textualist. Let me put it that way. For instance, things like the 50-year rule. Well, it's really not a rule. You know, it's more like the Pirates of the Caribbean. It's more like a significant guideline. But it depends on how you approach it. But you have to stay within the structures. You know, you can drag it right up to the edge, but then you have to work with that. I don't think it really limits it. And again, working with the idea of developing traditional cultural property is the cultural value to the group. So values are critical.
Well, Claudia, I'm glad you brought up the local level and your comments, because there is a much different landscape in sort of some of these processes at the local level than there is at the federal level, and also a little more freedom, right, to experiment as well. And so I wanted to turn the conversation to Stephanie and to you, who are both engaged with preservation issues at the urban, sort of more local urban level. And I'm going to start with Stephanie, if you don't mind. I'll start with you. You know, your research looks at historic preservation activities in cities that have experienced economic decline or considerable periods of disinvestment. And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about some of the challenges presented in making decisions under our current preservation systems in disinvested places, which often also correspond with minority and minoritized communities. And I wonder if you could talk about the sort of positionalities or perspectives and basic requirements of our processes in the current systems that pose barriers when these communities are seeking to have their heritage recognized.
Sure. So thank you for that. And I'm just, I should just start by saying I'm so happy to be here today, and I love these kinds of conversations. I also think it's important to recognize my own positionality when I offer sort of ideas and critiques. I am an academic and not a primarily an academic and not a practitioner. So, and I live and work now in Cleveland, which is of course a city that's experienced massive decline, which I think is well known. And so I think a lot about when, and I use this as a preface, when I offer critiques of our current systems, it's not that I think they all need to be like tossed in the garbage, right? It's more that I think they're just not enough, right? That we have a certain toolkit and maybe we need to expand it or find ways to expand it to address a range of places. And so I'll give a kind of couple examples as I talk about this. Our preservation systems in disinvested places. So we have a neighborhood here in Cleveland that has been experiencing population decline, which of course comes with economic decline. The two are intertwined for 100 years. So it peaked in population in 1920. And this is much longer, I think, than a lot of people think about urban neighborhoods experiencing decline, which we think of as like a post-World War II phenomenon. So when you have a neighborhood that's experienced decline for 100 years, you have things like massive demolition. Something like more than 75% of the traditional wood frame houses are covered in siding. Windows have been replaced, and all of these things have occurred because there's less people there, and the people that remain there have significantly less money and resources than the people maybe who were there before, even if it's always been kind of a working class neighborhood. And so I think a lot about the complexity of that, right? Like that creates, I use this word messiness, right? It just creates a really messy built landscape. And in my view, it doesn't mean it's any less historic than any other, you know, neighborhood that developed in the late 1800s and early 1900s in the city. But the view of, I think, preservationists and by our regulations is that it kind of doesn't count anymore, right? It's too messy. It's too changed. The landscape is messy. And I've raised the issue in my work about what if decline itself is significant, right? If a neighborhood's been experiencing decline for 100 years, when do those markers in the built environment themselves become significant aspects? And I don't think, certainly our local regulatory system, which is a pretty traditional historic district and landmark buildings, we don't have the capability of addressing a question like that, right? from a process. And I don't know how the National Register would address a question like that, right? If the markers of the physical markers of decline are significant. And then I think we layer on top of that messiness, I call it like a messiness of heritage, right? Because these are maybe, as I like the word minoritized, right? Not originally minority communities, but now minority communities, where you have places where the you determine the significant history predates the community that lives there now. But then we want to talk a lot about engaging local populations and residents that live there now, but tell people that their history is less important than the history that came before them, and the changes they've made to their neighborhood are destructive or not appropriate, right? They're not appropriate by our certain standards. So I think that adds a lot of, I don't come to this discussion with answers. I come to it more with a curiosity of thinking about ways that we can move forward to address these questions. So how do we connect to people who live in messy places, right? Places that have experienced change, where the industrial development, right? The development during the industrial era was by a different population than the one that lives there now. But maybe the African American, Cleveland is primarily, we're primarily talking about African American neighborhoods, to a much smaller extent, Latinx neighborhoods. But, there are a few places, and it's easier when we have neighborhoods that were sort of built by African Americans and are still African American neighborhoods, but places with a strong Jewish history or some form of Eastern European immigrant history as the people who kind of founded or the original, if you will, occupants or builders of a neighborhood. And there's real difficulty. There's difficulty getting people on board with local designation when it's not connected to the kind of current lived experience of people. So I think there are these barriers. I often write a lot of pretty heavy critiques about the emphasis on material integrity. And I hear Paul saying he has trouble sort of, grasping with that still. And I understand it, but I think it creates a huge barrier. And even if there are other paths, I don't know that they're well known, as we've talked about, right? So if the material integrity is an issue, but there are other paths to designation, I think the perception is that without the material integrity, it will be a non-starter, and then that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I'd love to hear kind of how other folks who are more on the ground think about and deal with some of these challenges as well.
Okay, I'll bite quickly. No matter what resource you have, the way the structure is set up, it's not designed to do everything.
Right.
And that's one of the things that I worry about when it's not, and I'm speaking to you, but I've seen people come along with different ideas. The Underground Railroad was a good example of it. They didn't quite know what to do with that. And in that case, they said, well, it's not really fitting. Let's do another program. But there has to be some level of material integrity. Even McDonald Hall has some. It's got a frame. Something. The question is not, does it have to be beautiful and wonderful? The question is there enough integrity left to support whatever other criteria you were working with in terms of the aspects of integrity? And I mean, I remember doing nominations and reviewing nominations when I was in Connecticut for the city of Bridgeport. They had 4 urban districts. They were all Hispanic neighborhoods. They weren't the best thing physically. So there were a lot of bad spots, but these were actually neighborhoods where the neighborhood came and said, we want to do this. You know, we feel this is important to our neighborhood. It's important for us to preserve, not only for us, but to preserve what's come before us. And all of them were listed. They were not the greatest in material integrity, but they had enough, especially in terms of a contextual relationship, building to building, arrangements, streetscapes, landscapes. Those were all fairly intact. And we were really pleased to be able to say, we've got enough to go with this structure to do that. But the register program and the landmarks program have to have some kind of structure. Without any structure whatsoever, it simply is, what do I think? The question again sometimes is how you evaluate and how nuanced you are when you take a look at some of those things. So I understand what you're saying. The other flip side of it is, quite frankly, we just can't preserve everything.
Yeah, and I think I would chime in quickly that I think not only about the National Register or what other types of programs might exist or be created, right, to handle like things that aren't a good fit, right, for the register, or ways to preserve things where we might not keep every building intact. And at the local level, like, so here in Cleveland, without going into too much detail, we have a landmarks commission. They designate districts and buildings, and we are incredibly resource constrained community. The city is fiscally, so there's not a lot of money for surveys and other types of activities. But I really think that at the local level, right, where the rubber meets the road for preservation, a lot of times that more tools, some development. I like, you know, Claudia mentioned before, and I hope she talks more about her cultural significance reports and cultural mapping, like other ways of honoring histories and heritage at the local place beyond our district and building designations and certificate of appropriateness review, right? Like that's pretty much what we have here at the local level. And it so often feels like not enough to deal with the range of places that really have made this city and you know, many, if not all others, you know, interesting places over time.
Yeah, I can remember writing letters when we had a situation where it wasn't eligible for the state or national register.
Mm-hmm.
Be very careful to note that while it did not meet those particular criteria, this area is clearly an area of great significance to the local community, and that should be dealt with and treated as such, which is the best we could do, because we couldn't. And believe me, we had that approach well developed for that very reason, because you know, there's life after the register, frankly. I know that's kind of speaking in, you know, but anyway, yeah, and sometimes it's a harsh reality that you can't make the register do everything, but the register is not the only thing out there, and preservationists need to recognize that too, and work to find those other possibilities and solutions. That's beyond historic preservation. That's community preservation.
Right, absolutely.
Something that's troubled me, I know there are different programs that can recognize the importance of sites. But I think there's a certain, cachet is not quite the right word, but there's an importance to being listed on the National Register. Oftentimes, as you know, as Paul pointed out, it is a federal planning tool. It doesn't necessarily get you anything. Yes, it can be tied to tax and credits. It can be tied to certain grants and aid. I don't mean to dismiss that, but oftentimes we say it's simply honorary. And I think it is important that the National Register then continue to expand, as it has, to encompass the diversity of sites that represent the American experience. How we do that, how we continue to move forward with some of these sites where there's been disinvestment and there's no there there, that is a problem. There has to be something there. And that's something that we at the Register struggle with and will continue to work through with our preservation partners, both at the state and the local level, to try and sort out, is there a way to move forward? Maybe there isn't. I do not know. I don't mean to be preemptive on that. It's going to take some continued consultation with our partners. We are, we've talked about who decides, who authorizes. Certainly we have, at the National Register, we have a legal, we have statutory, we have regulatory authority, we have that responsibility. That is our job. But we are not per se, we're not the deciders per se, we're not the final arbiters. Yes, we are legally. The keeper makes a decision and the keeper is the final decision on these things. But at the moment, I don't know that we're being as inclusive as we can, simply because we don't have all the information we need to be inclusive. Good decisions rest on good information. And I'm quite confident at the moment. I am not expressing this well. But my point is that I recognize the importance to communities of being on the National Register, even if it doesn't, quote unquote, get them anything. But I appreciate too the restrictions that we have at the National Register, the limitations of what we can do. But then again, as the Register has continued to evolve since it was first instituted in 1966 with the National Historic Preservation Act, it will continue to evolve, and it's exciting to see where it will go, and it's exciting to see how we can work with all of our preservation partners in moving it forward further into the 21st century.
Well, I'm going to thank you all for that. I'm going to pitch the next question to Claudia, who I think is well positioned as we're coming down to the end of our maybe towards the last section of our moderated time here individually, because the work that Claudia, that you are doing in San Antonio addresses so many of the issues that we've discussed, or seeks to find creative solutions and creative alternatives, much as we've just been discussing, for cultural heritage and cultural heritage recognition, which is so important to, it's the reason that we should never underestimate, I think, the honorary nature or the significance of representation that's afforded by public recognition of heritage. So the work that you've been doing in San Antonio really models a number of perspectives and techniques for characterizing and documenting heritage that are different from our systems at the federal and state levels. And in San Antonio, your programmatic work focuses on both tangible and intangible aspects of the community's heritage. And I wanted to invite you to tell us about that work, about the impetus behind the work and developing these programs in San Antonio, and something about the decision-making processes that you are employing for identifying and inscribing local heritage.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm learning so much from listening to everyone and hearing comments made, not just by the panelists, but in the chat area. And I guess what I'd like to start with is the question that we started this panel with when we were discussing this over email, and it's like, who decides? And our stance in San Antonio is really that the people decide. The people have to tell us what is important to them. And this is where working in a municipality is different from working at a federal level. We're able to craft ordinances or policies that meet the framework that's required by the local community. what works in San Antonio isn't necessarily going to work everywhere else. But I'm hoping that the sort of structure we've created can help inform other places. And I think the first place I would start is how citizens are empowered. And first of all, my job exists because the citizens required it. They were upset because a very important, culturally significant building was demolished. That was the building where Univision, the first Spanish language station in the nation, was born. And that was here in San Antonio. We think of it as a worldwide industry, and it is, but it really started here in San Antonio. And so as a result, the citizens requested that this position be created so that Univision doesn't happen all over again. So my job really was to see was it possible that a culturally significant building wasn't designated at a local level. And the first thing I did, and some people on this call may have heard this before, but the first thing I did on my very first day was I looked at our criteria for designation. There's 16, and they basically verbatim mirror Secretary of Interior standards. And I circled everyone that used the word culture in it. And it turns out of the 16, 7 of them refer directly to culture. And you only need 3 to meet 3 criteria to be designated locally. So then the next question was, okay, if our ordinances allow this, why isn't it happening? And a lot of it was about interpretation, is who is interpreting, who is saying what's culturally important and what's not. And so we turned that over to citizens. And so someone wanted to know a little bit about the cultural mapping. I took that to think about how documentation is so important, something that we do in preservation. And is we've created all of these little cubby holes, all of these little boxes that need to be checked off. And documentation is a huge part of that. And the communities that I deal with are often orally based communities. Some of them struggle to produce deeds. Some of them struggle to produce any kind of documentation showing either ownership or affiliation with a property. So we conduct oral histories to really understand how people feel connected to a certain place. And then we ask them to draw maps. We literally they are drawing maps. Some of them are beautiful artwork. Some of them people really want to be very cartographic and precise. So we have a gamut of them, but what they really are is data. And so we've begun running this through GIS systems and are able to identify places that to trained preservationists may not look like a place that's important, but with the information we have gathered from community, we understand it is important, and we better understand why it's important. So I've begun the cultural significance reports, as I mentioned earlier, and I put a link to them in the chat. Basically, I only do those when a property is really threatened, when there's actually a threat. We gather all the data, but aren't necessarily writing for each property until it becomes necessary. And from that, as Paul mentioned, sometimes maybe we need to recognize a property in a different way. A lot of the communities that I talk to really look at designation for its honorary effect, that they are looking for recognition. Along with designation comes a lot of other issues, however, in regulation in terms of design and treatment. And our blocking point has been that we're able to designate, but we're not quite sure what we do with the property afterwards. What's the treatment? You know, if it were to come to design review, what do our commissioners do with that? So, so some of these reports help to guide that information. But a lot of them, we can tell, we can designate, but they're going to be difficult to recommend treatments for, at least in the way that our ordinances stand, because the design review is based on the Unified Development Code that the city operates. So that doesn't always offer anything for the intangible or how the intangible is manifested in the tangible. It's very much focused on design and materials. So we've developed other ways of recognizing properties, and that's what we call cultural heritage districts or cultural heritage landmarks. This is evolving. This is specifically right now honorary, but we are looking at ways that we might be able to change that. Perhaps it's a matter of zoning, for instance. In a couple of the properties, people aren't necessarily upset if the property changes the way it looks. What they're upset about is how the property's being used. So I'll use an example. We had a beloved landmark called the Malt House. Architecturally, it was very difficult to describe. And it was just a regular car hop. And when it was designated back in 2013, it was designated on the reasons it was important, which were it was a gathering space. It was where our LULAC, the Latino United, I forgot what everything LULAC stands for, but LULAC was first meeting because they didn't have a meeting place. It's where people go to celebrate anniversaries and quinceañeras, and that's where I would go after high school football games to celebrate. So it was a gathering place, and that was what made it important. So when it was designated, there wasn't a lot of detail about the architecture. And the property owner, business owner, lost the business basically and wanted to sell to 7-Eleven. What people were upset about was not that the property might change the way it looks, but that 7-Eleven was coming in and disrupting a mom and pop, what had been a mom and pop place. Preservation can't save that, right? That's not something that's in our ordinance. So one of the things we've done is create a legacy business program in the hopes that businesses like that can be sustained. So it's working in coordination with our economic development department, working in coordination with some of our other departments that may be able to facilitate better environments for a business to thrive. And then the other place where we've crossed over is in affordable housing. Someone asked, I saw in the chat, whether anybody has done overlapping or overlaying maps with redlining. I just presented on that this morning, and I'm sorry, I'm stuttering a little bit. It's because my brain is trying to switch from one presentation to another. But I was presenting on a shotgun house initiative that we're working on now to identify every shotgun house in the city of San Antonio. And in that, we are developing a model for treating vernacular architecture. And hopefully preserving them, but not just preserving them as shotgun houses, but also preserving them as affordable housing. And I did an overlay of all of the shotgun houses that I have found so far, and they all exist in red line districts. So we are now working with our Office of Equity and our Neighborhood Housing and Services Development Department to see if we can ensure that people get to stay in those homes. So not only will we try to address how do we rehab these, but how do we ensure that they remain affordable housing, don't become Airbnbs like we're seeing in a couple of parts of town, and how do we ensure that families get to continue living in them. So that's a fast overview of some of what we're doing, because I want to be able to address people's questions as well.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much. I think, if I'm not mistaken, we're at about the point where we are ready to start answering questions from our attendees. And I see that there are some in the Q&A, queue. But if you have audience members, viewers, if you have more, please do add them, and we will get to as many of them as we can. I'm going to start. There's some comments, some questions. I'll start with the first one from Charles Kaminsky. He says, I feel that the criterion for nomination of sites is primarily biased towards architecture and architects, etc., versus cultural heritage sites. And the majority of the sites, I suspect they represent the white and economically advantaged versus the marginalized, underrepresented communities of color, Black, Brown, Indigenous. How can the designation be looked at to encompass sites of cultural significance to these communities of color?
I would say that certainly the earliest nominations that came in were architecturally focused, and we still see that because it's expedient for a community or perhaps a group of graduate students to do a windshield survey, to drive around, and what's going to pop out are the architecturally significant buildings. It is more challenging to identify perhaps individual buildings that may be of significance to communities under criteria A for events, or certainly under criteria B for people. That is a matter of, again, resources, doing that scholarship, finding out what's out there beyond what you can simply see. We are seeing increased number of nominations that come in under criteria A. Again, speaking with a reviewer this morning, she noted that 20% of the nominations she looked at in the past year addressed ethnic heritage and coming in under criteria A, events, as opposed to criteria C for architecture. So I find that encouraging, and hopefully that is something that we will continue to see.
And I think it's also important to remember that the whole process over time has always been a reactive process in terms of the government review part. I think it goes back to the notion of, really the grassroots is where that has to start. We can encourage, we can stimulate, but my office doesn't produce nominations. My office reviews them. And we certainly encourage people. And I think over time, there's been an encouragement, not only at the register, but in particular the landmarks program. I remember Secretary Salazar coming to us and saying, in 6 months, I want 11 new National Historic Landmarks. Well, he didn't really understand the process. It doesn't happen that fast. But with that directive, we got our marching orders. And in that case, we were much more able to be proactive because it was the landmarks program. And we produced a number of nominations for resources that related to farm workers, Chicano art. There's women-owned sites, women architects. I mean, we were, it's a slow process, so there wasn't a huge volume. The other part is, I think if you look at the National Register database, it's misleading. There are a lot of sites that do relate to minority history, and it's just that the history, they're older, they haven't had a lot of documentation on it. I mean, every Spanish mission relates to Hispanic history in the Southwest, and there's a lot of them. So, more needs to be done. There's no question about it. That's not only true with minorities, it's true with indigenous peoples. And I think that the good news is that the register is aware of it. The difficult news is there's not too much they can do to guarantee that will happen, other than to encourage that it begin at the base local level and people start looking at these resources. I will tell you, the state of Virginia has a lot of slave cabins. I know that for a fact, having researched that. A lot of times the federal government would sponsor grants. They sponsored one for African Methodist Municipal Church nominations. Or they'll do things like the Jewish farmers and the Rothschild. Things like that. That's helpful, certainly. And the Underrepresented Communities Grants Program is superb in terms of being a vehicle. So I think it's gotten better over time, but I think it's misrepresentation to say that this is simply a vehicle for white privilege at this point. I don't think it really holds up. We have more to do. We have more to do across the board. Certainly African American, Chinese American, Hispanic American, women. I mean, there's more to do. It's a growth industry. But I do think that the official policy now is to make sure that the register, which was never meant to be exclusive, it just kind of wound up that way, is proactively now as inclusive as we can make it. But there are limits, and a lot of those tend to be tied to capacity and knowledge and ability at the local level to begin that process.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
I was going to tie into this and also pick up on something that Claudia said earlier about records and ownership and deeds and documentation, right? And this is, I'm sure, something that comes up in a lot of minority and indigenous communities. Here we have issues sometimes in African American neighborhoods where a defining characteristic of them in the early 20th century was mobility and a lack of ownership. right? That families moved really frequently and they rented because that was all that they were allowed to do. They were not allowed to own, right? Even here in Cleveland. So in many cases, because of deed restrictions and that sort of thing. So documenting, there was an issue of a controversy about a house that Jesse Owens lived in here in Cleveland. And he only lived there for 6 months, and an argument pushed back that it wasn't long enough to make it historic. But that was indicative of the time that families moved that often. Or a home of an African-American mayor of a small town that's now been incorporated into Cleveland. And he was an African-American mayor in the early 20th century. And but couldn't own his house. And so there's not deed records to 100% prove that he lived in this particular house, but it's well known in oral traditions in the community. And so I think there are still, I appreciate what Paul is saying about the increase in inclusivity, but I still think that there are, I call these the structural bias, right? There is a structural bias in our systems that that will preclude some set, right, of historic places from being recognized in this way. And again, I don't really have the answer, but I think it's important to recognize that it's all of the ways that we review places and the documentation we require and how we can rethink trust in oral histories, right? Like that's an important thing. Trust in handed down knowledge and those sorts of things, and how we validate that. I think is something that the preservation profession would be well served by continuing to address. I don't want to say it's not addressed, but I think it's a really valid area where work should be done.
Yeah, and I agree, Stephanie. And just to piggyback on that, the two things that jumped out at me is the profession and then the we. And I think that the we in the profession needs to diversify so that when you begin to see more people of different cultural backgrounds joining the profession, I think that will open up what has been perceived as a structural bias, right? It's so similar to my work locally. There was the structure. And then when I looked at it just with a different set of eyes, was able to find how to work within that framework or decide whether the framework needs to change. And I think until historic preservation is being embodied by people of color, or when that happens, I think we'll begin to see inclusivity. And the National Trust is doing a great job of trying to recruit more people, providing diversity scholarships to attend the conference. So I think that there is change coming. It is very slow.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of other questions, quite a few questions to get through, so I'm going to roll on to the next one. This one is from Cindy Olnick. Would the National Register consider placing a temporary moratorium on National Register nominations that don't contribute to equitable representation to give underrepresented sites time to catch up, or I guess their nominators, perhaps, to catch up?
That is an interesting question. I saw that I saw that come in, and I've been trying to formulate a response to that for the past 20 minutes or so. I don't know that that would be productive. I don't know that the National Register is, whether it's important that there be some sort of a balance between this group and another group. Yes, there is some catch up that needs to happen, and I think that is happening now, but I can say too, when nominations come in, if we do see them deficient in perhaps addressing areas of history that we think would be appropriate for that nomination, they do get returned for those issues to be addressed. So I think that is one way that we're expanding the diversity within the National Register as well, not simply by rejecting nominations that might be too closely associated with already represented communities, but rather expanding a nomination as appropriate. Sometimes it isn't, but if it is, capturing that fuller story.
All right. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Oh, okay.
There we go. There's also a provision in the law which says, the act, which says if the keeper doesn't review a nomination within 45 days, it's automatically listed. So it's impractical to try to do a moratorium. It just means nothing gets reviewed. And once that starts happening in great measure, then we start to hear from Congress. There are practical implications. Now, having said that, I think you're right. I think, again, as I say, it's in essence, production is at the grassroots. The more interest there is in a type of resource, for instance, what you talked about with that particular instance in Cleveland, you can actually make, I think, a very legitimate argument about the background, basically the transient nature of life, blah, 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 all that. That's not unimportant. That actually is an incredibly significant aspect of history, especially, it's not just Cleveland. And relate to that. There's always a question. I mean, I can remember reviewing some resources where we weren't sure that they had it right, but the preponderance of what they were saying suggested that they were, so we went ahead and listed it. But it has to happen from the ground up. It can't be imposed. All the government process can do is try to provide some incentive to move in that direction. And right now, for the past, I would say past 10 years, particularly in the last 5, that's been the direction that the register program's been moving in. The National Park Service has been moving in that across the board. So, you know, it's not perfect and it won't be for a while, but certainly there are issues that are addressed. Keep in mind, back in the 60s, when they did nominations, it wasn't even the white men on the horse in the town green. It was the big flashy buildings. Over time, the low fruit gets picked. And as my dad used to say, you know, the fruit at the top of the tree may be smaller and may not be as prominent, but usually by the time you get there, it's a hell of a lot sweeter.
All right, so thank you. So there's a number of questions, I think, and some discussion that's come in on the issue of things like missions that we brought up missions as part of Latino heritage in the United States. And there are obviously sites like those missions can have multiple, you know, mean very different things to very different groups. And I know, Claudia, for example, you're in San Antonio where the missions are a World Heritage Site. You're probably dealing with those on a regular basis. I wonder if you might address some of these questions about how to negotiate historic resources that, you know, can in many ways represent, in some cases, genocide. For example, in California, for example, with the wiping out of Native populations through the mission system, or great dispersal and disruption to Native peoples.
Right, or something like Tule Lake, which basically was an internment camp for the Japanese, which is a National Historic Landmark.
Yes, right, exactly.
Not, you know, a lot of the stuff.
I'm sorry, you have these multiple positionalities, you know, in terms of thinking about how that heritage is viewed and stewarded in the future. Yeah. What are some of those strategies that perhaps you're employing on the ground there? Yeah,
or, you know, there's a site, I forgot the name of it, bear with me, but it has to do with the Mormons in Utah. And there was a massacre that was basically took place that was perpetrated by Mormons. They were not necessarily part of the power structure. And that site's been preserved. And over time, there's been a lot of healing that's gone on. Now, things like the missions out west, the problem is they don't tell that story. They are important and they are Hispanic related, but they need to tell that story over time in terms of how they got there, what they did. And that's where updating becomes, you know, hugely important. A lot of what's out there is identified, and keep in mind, you know, if I'm a state historic preservation officer and I have a thread on one of these, I don't have to go with just that brief architectural description that's in that nomination. You know, I can go on the basis of a lot more information now, but the nomination itself ideally should be brought up to date to tell the full story of why that site's important, not just the architecture. There was certainly a huge bias in the register towards architecture and archaeology when it was created in 1966. I think that the register has moved beyond that, particularly with its understanding and application of criterion A. So a lot of these things, it's like I say, it's not perfect, but I think it's improving. And I think that's the direction that we should continue to go. In the meantime, it would be nice to have the capacity to keep adding resources as well, especially since we're discovering a lot more resources related to newer immigrant groups that perhaps haven't been brought out before. I don't know if they ever did anything when there was a record store in New York City, which was one of the ones we were looking at about 10 years ago. And, you know, it wasn't the biggest shakes, you know, but it was a great resource.
So Claudia, would you like to add as well from your experiences in San Antonio?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's complex, and yet the solution in many ways was very simple. So throughout that nomination process, there was you know, hesitation from the indigenous community, and there was rebuttal from them. And what ended up happening was a series of listenings and hearings that, you know, utilize the tribal sorts of oral histories and traditions of just listening. And after a lot of listening, especially by a woman named Susan Snow, who was heading the nomination here in San Antonio, was a treasure in herself. You know, if I could landmark people, she'd be one of them. What we understood from listening to people is what they were upset about was this idea that they were Spanish colonial missions. And from the indigenous perspective, they were not Spanish colonial missions. They belonged to the indigenous. They were the ones who built it. They were the ones who were living in it. And they continued to live in the missions long after the Spanish left. And in fact, there are many people who are my age. I'm not saying I'm a young person. I'm not a spring chicken, but I'm also not on my way out just yet. And there were people my age who remembered their grandparents living at the missions. They remember visiting there on a weekly basis. It was their backyard. That's where they played. That's where they went to church. And so a lot of it was claiming who actually owned the missions, who did it belong to. And so what it ended up doing was changing the name of the nomination. It no longer was the Spanish colonial missions. It was just the San Antonio missions. And telling their story, as Paul was mentioning, was really important to that, and beginning to understand what role the indigenous peoples played in that, and understanding that in the nomination was what they were looking for. And interestingly enough, in the end, 3 criterion were put forward, which are different from the National Register. 2 of them were focused on the physicality of the property. The third one was really focused on the intangible element and the culture, the unique culture that was created when the indigenous and the Spanish came together and created a completely different new culture. That is why they got inscribed into the World Heritage List. So the indigenous population and those who were descended from them were very proud of that, because they felt that their culture had finally been recognized. And so that was the first place where I worked as part of my job, was to do cultural mapping and oral histories with them to ensure that we were gathering all those stories, because as we learned, it wasn't just about the missions. The indigenous and their descendants did not necessarily see these as standalone. This was a vital part of the community, and it was integrated and interwoven. And so understanding that part of the story was a crucial element that the community wanted us to gather. So while the Office of Historic Preservation does not have purview over the missions themselves, what we do have purview are the neighborhoods that are around them. And so our job is to ensure that it is a historic district, is that we are applying design guidelines as appropriate to the community there. And in fact, we just developed prescribed guidelines specific to that district based on the oral histories and cultural mapping that we did with them. And we just got that approved by council right before COVID-19 happened.
Congratulations on that. Yeah, so I'm thinking about sort of the, we're talking about shorter, maybe shorter documentation, but broader investigation and outreach on some of these, that is really critical, that really, tells us, because we all have our own, obviously positionalities from the places that we, from our own histories, that, we need those conversations to help us understand that and others. It's so important, such an important idea. Well, there's so many great questions left. I feel like, it's hard to choose once we're getting close to time here, though. There's a couple of great questions here. Maybe we could speed answer them. Let's see if we can do it. One of the questions is, Stephanie, how would you apply your insights to rural areas?
Right, so I saw that question. I will try and be fast. I've been thinking about this since I saw that question. and I think there's a few ways really quickly. So I think a lot of particularly small towns in more rural areas have experienced similar levels of disinvestment as many urban neighborhoods. And I think recognizing that as a sort of significant piece of their history is important. I also think in rural areas, you have minority communities often in the labor force, right? So whether that's a long history of immigrant laborers or African-American laborers or tenant farmers, things of that nature that can go kind of under the radar and under recognized with similar issues of documentation and so forth. And so I don't really have an answer, but as I'm quickly thinking about it, I think all of those areas are sort of parallel issues that the increasingly diversified preservation profession should should address as we move forward.
Thank you. Excellent speed answer. Okay, and then a question from Adrian Scott Fine from the Los Angeles Conservancy. Hi, Adrian. It says, on this question of who decides, preservationists and community groups are sometimes on different pages, especially when difficult, painful histories are involved regarding controversial places with layered stories, for example, urban renewal. If a community group presses for demolition of an eligible historic place as a way to right a previous wrong, any thoughts on how preservationists should respond? Claudia, go ahead, take it.
That's easy on the municipal level. We really do say, if the people will it, then it's whatever the people want. If they want it gone, then they have that choice. It's that simple here.
If I could follow up on that, that is what I was trying to get to earlier when I said, yes, the keeper makes a final decision on nominations, but I think the question of what should be preserved,
Disposition.
Community to bring forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically what everybody's going through with monuments down in the South now. Some of those monuments inherently in and of themselves are now historic, like it or not. But at the end of the day, again, the register identifies things that are worthy of preservation, doesn't guarantee they will be preserved. We're not the only policy thing out there. From time to time, things change. That's just the way it's going to be. Nobody's asked me yet, but changing the state of the name of the state of Rhode Island, it raises a lot of hackles for some people, and other people it's like, well, it's time. But what they don't realize is that almost every historic building owned by the state of Rhode Island says the state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, with big seals and headings over building doors. So we're going to have to wrestle with that. But my take is that that was certainly never anything that was created to be intentionally offensive, although you can make that argument for some other pieces in the South. And that certainly at the end of the day, it is the decision of the governor as to what does or doesn't happen. Our recommendation would be preserve those. Take them off all the non-historic buildings, no problem, but preserve those. But if you do, put up some kind of interpretive sign which explains why the Providence Plantations is there, what it means, what it originally was intended to be, and how it took on a connotation that was absolutely offensive to most of the African-American community, and rightly so. Use it as a teaching point. You can't always do that. But yeah, it's the same problem. And again, sometimes I have signed off on buildings where there's just no feasible and prudent alternative. It's just not feasible and prudent. The prudent part's usually the catch. So you have to recognize that in some communities, if a community makes that decision at the end of the day to remove it, whether it's by demolition or by moving it somewhere else, that is the community's right.
Stephanie, would you like to have the last word there?
Oh, I don't know if I want the last word, but I was just, I don't have anything that good to say. I was thinking about this and thinking that, it's important to realize that demolitions will happen, right? Like we can accept that. And that perhaps it's not to frame it as the community and preservationists will be on opposite sides. That will only occur if preservationists are not part of the community and already embedded in that community in some way. Mm-hmm. And so to me, it's like, if we could take a couple steps back and find ways for preservationists to become a more permeated type of activity across communities, there may be some reduction in those types of demolitions may still occur, the community may still want it, but there may be more alignment than we realize than just sort of thinking people are at odds because there's not a lot of interaction that occurs or has occurred.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it makes a lot of sense. I know that we had an issue in New Haven at one point where they wanted to build a community center. It was basically a daycare center in the midst of a very low income neighborhood. And we're going to take an historic building down to do it. And the preservation community said, well, we're sorry, but we think you're right. You know, in this case, it's going to be a greater benefit to this historic district to have that daycare there. Than losing the building that you're talking about taking. That integration process is absolutely key to coming up with a solution. It may not make anyone happy, but at least everybody has an opportunity to have that input.
Those are great last words about who decides. I think that those are great answers. And I think we all agree that community needs to have a very large say in what we preserve. Thank you all again for such an engaging conversation. As you could tell by the chat and Q&A, we had a lot of engagement. And also people on Facebook, thank you for joining us. Elaine, masterful job. Thank you for helping craft the conversation and leading it. And we encourage everyone to come back next week for more of our symposium. In the meantime, keep on preserving.